February 14, 1943, 9:20 a.m., 10 miles west of Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The morning air smelled of salt, burned diesel, and something metallic, the sheen of hot oil on a piston engine. Low clouds rode the ridge line, and the sea under them was the flat lead gray of a lead sheet. On the flight line at Henderson, a dozen young men in khaki and patched leather jackets walked toward their planes with that quick, businesslike step of men who have learned to measure chance in minutes. They checked their goggles, tightened scarves, clicked helmets in place. Nearby, a white-painted maintenance tent hissed as a mechanic sealed a cowl flap. The aircraft they were walking to did not look like the graceful birds drawn on recruitment posters. The Corsair's profile was brutal and oddly beautiful. A long, curving nose, a massive propeller that bit the air like a living thing, and a wing that dipped sharply then rose, the so-called bent or gull wing, strange against the sky. Lieutenant Kenneth "Ken" Walsh, second lieutenant then, a wiry 20-something whose jaw clenched when he was nervous, ran a final check over his F4U-1. The engine coughed and settled into a steady growl that made tools in the tent vibrate. "She's a handful on the deck," the flight mechanic muttered, rubbing oil from his hands, "but in the air she'll sing." Walsh clipped in, thumbed the throttle, and gave a last glance at the scrubby line of palms along the field. It was a thin moment. The line between life and a sky full of bullets had always been thin. Across the Pacific, aboard remote strips and in the cockpits of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, Japanese pilots had been watching photographs and hearing talk. The Corsair silhouette had become a subject of derisive cartoons and campfire jokes. "Bent wings," they said in clipped voices. "An ugly bird that can't outturn a Zero." The Zero was elegance itself, lithe, turning on a dime, an aircraft designed for dogfights that hugged the air like a practiced hawk. Japanese pilots nicknamed many Allied types with a mixture of scorn and affection, and the Corsair's odd wing and bulk invited mockery before the machines met in the sky. But mockery is a dangerous thing when metal and men are involved. At 9:35, Walsh and his flight VM F-124, 12 aircraft in formation, lifted off toward Bougainville on an escort duty for a PB-2I trying to reach a downed aircrew. The Corsairs rose with a stubborn aggression. The RM-2800 engine roared, the propeller sliced the moist morning. Climbing out, the pilots felt the aircraft pull, the control surfaces alive under their gloved hands. The Corsair did not want to be folded into a cozy turning fight. It wanted speed and energy, and the men who learned its temper found it answered. They found Japanese fighters waiting. From below, a scatter of Zeros, light, fast at lower speeds, vicious at close-in turning fights, braided up through the clouds. At first glance, the encounter looked like any other in the Pacific. Two styles of warfare confronting each other. A Zero flashed past, its pilot's face set in concentration. Observers on the U.S. side saw the flash of olive drab and the red Hinamaru. On the Japanese side, an experienced pilot sneered into his wind, noting the Corsair formation's awkward approach, the bent wing, the stubby canopy, the long nose. "Clumsy," he thought aloud, "we will dance them down." But the Corsair's strengths were not in graceful dances. Lieutenant Walsh throttled up, felt the G climb onto his chest, and the Corsair lunged. Where the Zero gambled on tight turns, the Corsair answered with a different language. Speed, climb, dive. Walsh pushed the stick, trading tight maneuvers for altitude and velocity. The Corsair's Pratt and Whitney, engine a heavy, throaty heart, screamed, and the air itself seemed to compress behind the prop wash. Suddenly the geometry of combat changed. A Corsair could climb through a turn, outclimb a Zero, and when needed, put its nose down and dive away, the speed bleeding off the enemy's advantage. In the hands of a pilot who understood energy tactics, that bent wing was not a handicap, it was a tool. The first engagement that morning was messy and quick. A Zero attempted to pull inside Walsh's turn. A Corsair snapped its head in a scissor of motion and opened fire with .650 caliber machine guns, tracers stitching the sky. The sound of bullets on air, the smell of cordite and hot metal, the bitter metallic tang of adrenaline, these were sensations the pilots knew intimately. A Zero spiraled and fell, smoke trailing like ink in water. In the chaos, Walsh watched another Corsair trade altitude and dive, reappearing behind a different Japanese fighter. Within minutes, the pattern repeated. It was not graceful ballet. It was brutal arithmetic of speed and altitude. Word spread back to the Japanese pilots like a cold wind. Tales of Corsairs that outclimbed Zeros, that could dive away from a turning fight and come back on their terms, turned mocking laughter into a different sound. A quiet, hard attention. Over the weeks that followed, more Corsairs arrived. VM F-124 learned faster still how to press the machine's advantages. They taught each other to avoid low-speed throwdowns and instead to use boom and zoom tactics. A passing burst at high speed followed by a climb back to safety. The Zero could still outturn them, and there were losses, always losses, but the equation on which many naval aviators had counted was shifting. Back at the tarmac, mechanics swapped stories in the grease and coffee steam. They called her an ugly duckling. One grinned, wiping his hands on a rag. She's a swan when you let her run. In the pilot's quarters, Walsh wrote a line in a dispatch that would be read and reread. The Corsair didn't need to be pretty to kill. For Japanese pilots who had once laughed at the gull wing, the sight of an American fighter climbing overhead and then diving to strike with brutal speed became an image that cut through bravado like a blade. By May, a handful of Marine Corsair Aces pilots whose names would be inked into squadron lists and later into history were beginning to tally kills at rates that made Japanese flight leaders frown. The laughter that greeted talk of the Corsair's odd shape had been replaced by a wary silence. The gull wing that inspired jokes had become, for many pilots, a warning. March 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. The heat came off the tarmac in waves, distorting the horizon and making the Zeros look like ghosts shimmering in the sun. Japanese ground crews moved quickly in the haze, refueling hoses. Belts of 7.7 ammunition, crates of spare parts scavenged from other planes. The smell of burnt fuel hung in the air, and above it, the metallic clatter of engines being tested filled the humid afternoon. Lieutenant Saburo Sato, a veteran of the early Pacific campaigns, leaned against his aircraft, wiping sweat from his brow. His Zero, once the pride of the skies, sat with its cowling off, streaked with oil. The older mechanics grumbled. Supply ships from Truk were being intercepted and replacement parts were scarce. But Sato's attention wasn't on logistics. It was on the new rumors that had reached the base the night before. Stories of a strange, brutish American fighter with bent wings that could dive faster than anything the Imperial Navy could chase. Ugly, one pilot had said over dinner, trying to laugh it off. Like a bird that forgot how to fly. But others stayed silent. They'd seen reports, kill ratios that made no sense. 11-1. The kind of number you'd expect from propaganda, not a combat report. Sato took a drag from his cigarette and stared at the horizon. "Let's see if it's real," he murmured. That afternoon, they saw it for the first time. The mission was routine, a sweep to intercept an American raid approaching Bougainville. 8 Zeros, including Sato's, climbed through broken clouds, sunlight glinting off the ocean below. They expected to meet Wildcats or P-40s, planes they'd fought and beaten many times before. Instead, they saw silhouettes they didn't recognize. Long-nosed, broad-shouldered aircraft glinting silver blue in the sun. The new arrivals were climbing steeply, too steeply. "Corsairs," Sato heard through the radio. "They climb like," the voice cut off in static. He banked left, pulled hard, and found one on his tail, enormous propeller flashing, 6 guns flashing white tongues of flame. The noise, that throaty, violent snarl of the Pratt and Whitney RMS-2800, filled the air, and tracer rounds zipped past his canopy, cutting glowing lines through the mist. The Corsair overshot him, then rose vertically like a hawk stooping upward. No Japanese aircraft could do that, not with that kind of speed. The gull wings flexed under strain, then leveled, and the big fighter came around again, a gray shadow with death in its wake. "Impossible," Sato hissed, yanking the stick and diving hard toward the sea. But the Corsair followed nose down, engine howling. The Zero, light and graceful, had always relied on agility, not armor. In tight turns and low speeds it could dance, but the Corsair refused to dance. It sprinted. It climbed. It struck and withdrew, and in that terrible rhythm it dominated the sky. When Sato finally broke free, smoke in his wake, one wing punctured, he climbed out over the ocean and glanced behind him. The Corsair wasn't following. It had already found another target. He saw it flash past one of his wingmen, guns roaring, and the Zero burst into flame, tumbling end over end before vanishing into the sea. That evening, Rabaul's ready room was quiet. The pilots who returned sat on wooden crates, their flight suits soaked with sweat, eyes fixed on the floor. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, one of the younger pilots broke the silence. "That plane, it was so fast. It didn't turn. It didn't need to." Another added, "It climbs like a demon. And those guns, 6 of them." Sato said nothing. He was staring at a torn photograph in his hands, a picture taken months before, showing him beside his squadron after a victory over Guadalcanal. Every man in that photo had worn the same confident smile, the same belief that Japanese pilots were invincible. Now that belief was cracking. Across the Pacific, in the humid briefing rooms of Marine Air Group 12, the Americans had already learned how to wield the Corsair like a blade. "Don't turn with a Zero," instructors warned. "Use the climb, use the dive. Hit hard, hit once and climb out." One of those instructors, Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, a name whispered with a mix of awe and disbelief even among Marines, was showing just how deadly the Corsair could be. His squadron, the famed Black Sheep of VM F-214, turned the gull-winged fighter into a legend. Boyington was blunt. "The Corsair's ugly, sure, but I don't need pretty, I need alive." And alive he was. Over the Solomons, the Black Sheep claimed dozens of kills in a matter of weeks. The Corsair's howl became the sound of doom to Japanese pilots, a deep mechanical roar that rolled through the clouds like thunder. By late 1943, Sato's squadron had lost half its strength. His remaining pilots flew with caution, rarely engaging unless they had altitude or surprise. The laughter that once filled their mess hall, the jokes about the American gull-winged beast, were gone. One night, while staring at the flickering oil lamp in his tent, Sato wrote a single sentence in his flight log. "The new American fighter is ugly, yes, but beauty does not kill." He closed the logbook and pressed his palm against it, feeling the faint tremor of distant thunder or perhaps another Corsair tearing through the clouds. January 1944, over the Solomon Sea. The weather was clear, high clouds streaked like brushstrokes across the vast blue. Below, the ocean shimmered, calm and deceptive. From 20,000 feet, it looked peaceful, but every pilot in the formation knew the Pacific was littered with the bones of men and machines. Captain Ken Walsh adjusted the trim on his F4U Corsair, feeling the slight resistance through his gloved fingers. He was flying lead today, a patrol with VM F-124. His canopy glass was smeared with salt spray and oil smudges, and beneath him the Corsair's long nose pointed like a spear at the horizon. The radio crackled faintly in his ears. "Control to Red Leader. Enemy bogey spotted 20 miles out, Angels 15, Vector 060. Walsh didn't need to look for confirmation. He could already see them, faint specks glinting in the sun, moving in tight formation. Zeros. "All right, boys," he said calmly, "time to go to work." He pushed the throttle forward, and the Corsair answered with a growl that vibrated in his chest. The propeller blurred into a silver disk, and the aircraft lunged ahead. The rest of his flight fell into position behind him, the dark silhouettes of the bent-wing fighters slicing through sunlight. From the Japanese side, the encounter looked very different. Flight Officer Hiro Tanaka, one of the few surviving veterans of the early war years, squinted through his goggles at the oncoming formation. The American fighters were unfamiliar once, now they were nightmares. The Corsair's dive profile was unmistakable, huge wings bent like claws, nose down, sunlight flashing off the leading edges. "Corsairs," he muttered over the radio. His voice cracked slightly. "Stay high, avoid their dives." But he knew it wouldn't matter. The engagement began with a flash of movement and sound, 650 caliber machine guns erupting at once from each American plane. The air between the formations turned into a lattice of glowing tracers. The Corsairs didn't bother with dogfights. They didn't have to. They struck fast, savage, then pulled away into vertical climbs where no Zero could follow. Tanaka banked hard right, feeling the G-force crush him into his seat. His canopy flashed white as a Corsair streaked past overhead, guns blazing. He tried to roll away, but the heavier American fighter was already climbing again, ready to swoop. In moments the sky was chaos. Zeros twisted and spun, desperate to shake their pursuers, but the Corsairs were everywhere, diving, climbing, roaring past like mechanical hawks. Walsh's guns chattered, brass casings streaming from the wings. A Zero blossomed into smoke and flame. Another dove straight for the sea, trailing black smoke like an oil slick in the wind. Walsh pulled up sharply, the Corsair straining, wings trembling under pressure. He leveled out at 24,000 feet, sweat running down his neck. "Red 2, you still with me?" "Affirmative," came the answer. "They're scattering." Walsh glanced over his shoulder and saw it. The enemy formation breaking apart, turning into dozens of fleeing dots over the endless blue. On the ground at Bougainville that afternoon, mechanics gathered around the returning Corsairs. Their cowlings were streaked with cordite, gun barrels blackened, the smell of hot metal thick in the humid air. Marines joked, slapped backs, and counted bullet holes. Gotta name her something tougher than Ugly Duckling now. That evening, as the pilots debriefed in the tent, Colonel William Wild Bill Jies, commander of Marine Air Group 12, walked in with a grin. He dropped a sheaf of papers on the table. "Kill ratios," he said, "unofficial but close enough. 11-1. A few men whistled. Walsh just leaned back, staring at his cup of coffee. "They said she'd never make carrier grade," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Too heavy, too wild. Funny thing is, so were we." For the Japanese, the picture was grim. Reports from Rabaul, Truck, and the marshals told the same story. Squadrons shredded, experienced pilots gone, replacements dying before they learned the Corsair's name. Tanaka wrote home that spring a letter that would never be delivered. "They call it the bent-wing demon. When we see it, we turn, we climb, but it always follows. Its guns sound like thunder. Some men laugh before battle. None laugh after." By mid-1944, the Corsair was everywhere. Marine squadrons were flying from carriers again, after months of modifications and practice. Its once criticized design, the long nose, the awkward stance, the bent wings, had become its signature. Those wings gave it clearance for a larger propeller, which in turn gave it unmatched speed and power. Its design, mocked as clumsy, was in fact the solution to a problem no other fighter could solve: how to harness the most powerful piston engine in the war. Even the Navy, once skeptical, had come around. By the end of the year, both Marines and naval aviators were calling the F4U Corsair exactly what it had become: the finest fighter in the Pacific. In Tokyo, a senior naval officer studied intelligence photographs taken from downed reconnaissance planes. He pointed at one, a Corsair resting on a coral runway. "Ugly," he said softly. Then he added, "but terrifying." Outside, the sound of Allied bombers echoed faintly in the distance. The officer folded his hands and said to no one in particular, "The age of beauty in war is over." Back at Bougainville, Ken Walsh wrote a single line in his logbook before turning in that night. "They used to laugh at the wings. They don't laugh anymore." Outside his tent, a Corsair sat in the moonlight, its gull wings curved like a bird at rest. Tomorrow it would rise again, that ugly, magnificent machine that had rewritten the laws of the Pacific sky. June 15, 1944. Majuro Atoll, Marshall Islands. The air was thick with humidity, and the coral dust clung to everything: boots, uniforms, even the sleek metal bodies of the aircraft lined along the strip. In the distance, palm trees swayed and the lagoon shimmered in the sunlight. The war had moved north toward the Marianas, and the Corsairs waited like crouched predators, their wings folded high, gull-shaped and motionless. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington leaned against the ladder of his F4U, a cigarette between his fingers, helmet hanging from his other hand. He had the look of a man who had seen too much sky, lines cut deep around his eyes, a grin that didn't quite reach them. Around him, his squadron, the famed VM F-214 Black Sheep, prepared for yet another sortie. "You know," he said to his wingman, "the Japs used to laugh at these birds." The younger pilot smirked. "Ain't laughing now, Major." Boyington exhaled smoke and nodded toward the horizon. "No, they aren't, not anymore." He stubbed the cigarette out on the ladder, climbed into the cockpit and pulled the canopy down. The ground crew stepped clear. When the engine roared to life, that deep, throat-shaking growl of the RMS-2800 double Wasp, every man nearby felt it in his bones. A few thousand miles away, Japanese pilots on Tinian were hearing the same sound from the wrong end of the fight. Captain Saburo Saito, now gaunt from exhaustion and short on fuel, stood on the flight line watching as a single Corsair flew overhead, low and fast, strafing the airfield. The rounds tore through the runway, exploding fuel drums and scattering debris. His men ran for cover as tracer fire lit the afternoon sky. He caught a glimpse of the aircraft, that unmistakable bent-winged silhouette glinting in the tropical sun. The pilot pulled up, banking away toward the sea, and Saito felt something twist in his chest. That sound, that terrible, mechanical growl, had become the sound of defeat. He thought back to the early days of the war, when Zeros had ruled the sky, when Japan's pilots were invincible. They had mocked the clumsy American designs, called them bricks with wings. But the brick had learned to fly faster, higher, harder. The war had changed. So had the sky. By the summer of 1944, the F4U Corsair had rewritten air combat across the Pacific. It was faster than any Allied carrier fighter, climbing to 20,000 feet in under 7 minutes. It could dive at speeds that made the Zero's wings shudder and tear. Its 6 Browning .50 caliber guns could shred through thin-skinned Japanese fighters and bombers alike. But it wasn't just the aircraft, it was the men who mastered it. Marine squadrons from Guadalcanal to Okinawa adapted their tactics to exploit the Corsair's brute strength. Instead of turning engagements, they fought in vertical space, boom and zoom, attack from altitude, climb away before the enemy could counter. Where early U.S. aircraft had been outmaneuvered, now it was the Japanese who found themselves powerless to respond. Their once graceful Zeros became prey, their agility meaningless against sheer horsepower and American discipline. By late 1944, the Corsair was averaging kill ratios above 11:1 in the Pacific theater. Entire Japanese squadrons were erased in single sorties. In September, at a debriefing on Espiritu Santo, Colonel William Gies addressed a room full of new pilots. Behind him stood a massive photograph of a Corsair in flight, its wings catching sunlight like a blade's edge. "You'll hear stories from the other side," he said. "They used to laugh at her, called her ugly, said she'd never make a good fighter." He paused, letting the silence hang. "Good thing we weren't trying to win a beauty contest." The room erupted in low laughter. But Gies's tone hardened as he continued. "Every man who climbs into one of these needs to remember something. That ugly plane saved lives. It brought our boys home. It beat an enemy that thought it owned the sky." He nodded once firm. "You treat her with respect." By 1945, the Corsair had become legend. Its pilots, Boyington, Walsh, Kepford, and others, were national heroes. The aircraft that had once been mocked for its awkward design, now stood as the definitive symbol of American air power in the Pacific. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Corsair's roar filled the air as it strafed beaches, provided cover for advancing Marines, and dueled Japanese kamikazes head-on. From those battles onward, every Japanese pilot who saw that curved wing on the horizon knew exactly what it meant. After Japan's surrender, the skies finally fell silent. Many Corsairs were left parked in long rows under the tropical sun, their once glorious paint fading, their wings drooping like tired shoulders. But for those who had flown them, the memory of that machine never faded. Ken Walsh, by then one of the top Marine aces, once said in an interview, "They laughed at her at first. Hell, some of us did too. But the Corsair, she didn't care. She just kept flying. And once she took the sky, nobody could stop her." In Japan, Saburo Sato survived the war. Years later, he told an interviewer, "The first time I saw the Corsair, I laughed. The last time I saw it, I prayed." On the rusted airstrips of the Pacific, time has buried the noise and fury of those days. The laughter, the mockery, the fear, all reduced to silence. But sometimes, when a vintage Corsair flies at an airshow and that old engine roars to life, the ghosts of those battles return. For just a moment, the sky remembers. And somewhere above the endless Pacific, the bent-winged bird still flies, ugly, defiant, and utterly victorious.